They said the alien was worthless, and for once, Ethan Cole almost believed them, because she didn't look like anything worth saving, not in a place like this where value was measured in fuel cells and survival hours, where a bad choice could cost you your last meal or your last breath. The market stretched across half a mile of rusted plating and flickering neon, heat shimmering off broken engines while the air tasted like burnt copper and old storms. And in the center of it all, chained to a low metal platform, she knelt, small, fragile, blue skin dim like dying bioluminescence, her wrists locked in a restraint collar that hummed faintly with every shallow breath she took. Defective, one of the traders muttered, kicking the edge of the platform with a boot that had seen too many worlds. Barely functional, no strength, no output, not even worth scrapping. And laughter followed, low and careless, the kind that came easy when something wasn't considered alive enough to matter. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, fingers brushing the worn edges of his jacket pocket where exactly 200 credits sat on a chipped data chip, everything he had left after weeks of scavenging dead satellites and stripped cargo hulls. His ship running on fumes, his water recycler making that soft clicking noise that meant it wouldn't last another week. And still, he didn't move. Not at first. Because he had learned that hesitation kept you alive, that getting involved got you noticed. And getting noticed got you buried under the same sand that swallowed everyone else eventually. The alien lifted her head then, just slightly, just enough for the light to catch her eyes. And for a second Ethan forgot the noise, the heat, the smell. Because those eyes weren't empty, they weren't broken, they were watching, steady and quiet, like she was measuring something no one else could see. "You looking to buy scrap, human?" The trader called out, voice dripping with amusement. "I'll give you a discount, maybe she'll last you a night if you're lucky." More laughter, sharper this time, and Ethan felt it press against him, pushing him back toward the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that meant walking away. He exhaled slowly, feeling the dry air scrape his lungs, thinking about the last time he walked away from someone who needed help, thinking about the silence that followed him for months after, heavier than any cargo he'd ever carried. "How much?" he heard himself say, voice rough, like it had to push past something stuck in his chest. The trader blinked, surprised for half a second before the grin came back, wider now. 200 credits and she's yours, no returns. And just like that, the weight shifted, the crowd leaning in, waiting to see if the human would actually be stupid enough to pay full price for something already written off. Ethan stepped forward, boots crunching over scattered metal fragments, the sound loud in his own ears, and he didn't look at the others, didn't look at their smirks or the way they were already preparing to laugh again, because if he did, he might stop, and he couldn't afford to stop, not this time. The data chip left his hand before his brain caught up, a soft click as it transferred ownership, and just like that, everything he had was gone, traded for a life everyone else had already decided didn't matter. The collar released with a quiet hiss, the restraints unlocking as the trader stepped back, shaking his head. "Your funeral, human," he muttered, but Ethan was already kneeling, already reaching out, the alien skin cool against his hand, faint light pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat trying to remember how to be strong. And for a moment, just a moment, her gaze met his again, closer now, clearer, and he realized something that didn't make sense. Something that didn't fit the story everyone else had accepted. She wasn't afraid, not really. And as the wind picked up, carrying dust across the broken market and whispering against the edges of the world, Ethan lifted her carefully into his arms, unaware that somewhere far above, something had already started watching. The wind followed them out of the market like it was trying to erase what had just happened, grains of metallic dust skimming across Ethan's boots as he carried her through the maze of broken stalls and silent engines. Every step heavier now that the noise of the crowd was behind him and the consequences were finally catching up. His ship sat half a mile out past the scrap fields, a narrow silhouette against the horizon, patched hull catching the dull orange light of a dying sun, and he could already hear the faint stutter of its cooling system even from here, like it was reminding him how little time he had left before everything started to fail at once. The alien shifted slightly in his arms, not resisting, not clinging either, just adjusting as if she were learning the rhythm of his movement. and when he glanced down, he noticed the faint glow beneath her blue skin pulsing a little stronger, not bright, but steady, like a signal testing its own strength. "Stay with me," he muttered, more out of habit than necessity, because he had said those same words before to people who never answered, and he was not sure why he expected anything different now. To his surprise, her eyes opened again, clearer this time, focused not on the horizon or the ground but on him, studying him with a quiet intensity that made the back of his neck tighten. "You spent everything," she said softly, her voice uneven but controlled, the translator in his collar catching the words after a brief delay. "Why?" Ethan let out a dry breath, adjusting his grip as he stepped over a fractured panel half buried in the sand. "You needed help," he replied, like that should be enough, like it always should have been enough. She watched him for another second. Then her gaze shifted outward, scanning the empty expanse with a precision that did not match the weakness in her body, and Ethan felt it again, that small, nagging sense that something about this did not add up, like a piece of machinery that looked broken but still hummed beneath the surface. The wind picked up, colder now as the temperature dropped with the setting light, and Ethan shrugged off his outer layer without thinking, wrapping it around her shoulders, the fabric stiff with wear, but still holding enough heat to matter. And for a moment her glow flickered brighter, reacting to the warmth or maybe to the gesture itself. He could not tell. "Your environment is hostile," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Resources limited. Risk probability high." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is one way to put it," he said, shifting his pace as the ground sloped upward toward the ridge where his ship waited. "Welcome to my life." Silence settled between them after that. But it was not empty. It felt measured, like she was taking something in, storing it, and that made him more aware of everything else. The distant hum of engines somewhere far off. The way the sky seemed just a little too still, like it was holding its breath. Halfway up the ridge, his comm unit crackled once, a sharp burst of static that made him freeze for half a second before it went quiet again, and he frowned, glancing back toward the market. Now nothing more than scattered lights in the distance. "That is new," he muttered, tapping the side of the device. But it did not respond, just sat there like it was waiting. In his arms, the alien's fingers curled slightly against his sleeve, not in fear, not in pain, but almost like recognition. And when he looked down again, her eyes were no longer dim. They were alert, reflecting something unseen, something far beyond the horizon. And though her voice remained soft, there was a clarity in it now that had not been there before. "You should keep moving, Ethan Cole," she said, speaking his name with perfect accuracy despite the fact that he had never given it. "They are watching." The words settled into Ethan's chest like a sudden drop in pressure, not loud, not urgent, just precise enough to make his instincts tighten. And he did not ask how she knew his name, because the way she said it made the question feel irrelevant, like it had already been answered somewhere he could not see. Instead, he adjusted his grip and kept moving, boots digging into the incline as the ridge narrowed and the wind sharpened, slicing through the thin fabric left between him and the cold, his breath coming slower now, more measured, not from exhaustion but from focus, the kind that came when something unseen shifted the rules of the moment. "Who is watching?" he asked finally, voice low, eyes scanning the horizon where the sky met the endless stretch of broken metal and sand. But there was nothing there, no ships, no lights, just the same empty silence he had crossed 100 times before. In his arms. She did not answer right away, her gaze fixed upward, tracking something beyond. His range, and the faint glow beneath her skin pulsed again, stronger now, syncing not with his heartbeat this time, but with something external, something distant. "Not who," she said. After a second, her voice steadier than before. "What matters is why." And that answer did not help, not in any practical way. But it shifted something in him anyway, because people who were truly weak did not speak like that, did not choose their words like each one carried weight beyond the moment. They reached the top of the ridge, and his ship came into full view, a narrow, weathered frame resting at a slight angle where one landing strut never quite locked properly, its hull patched with mismatched plates, edges worn smooth by time and survival. And for a second Ethan felt a flicker of relief, small but real, because if he could just get her inside, If he could just seal the hatch and power the systems, then maybe whatever this was could be handled one step at a time. He moved faster, closing the last 30 yards as the temperature dropped another few degrees. The ground crunching underfoot as frost began to settle across the exposed surfaces, and when he reached the ramp, he paused just long enough to tap the manual release. The mechanism responding with a slow hydraulic hiss that sounded louder than it should have in the still air. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of recycled air and warm circuitry wrapped around him, grounding him in something known, something controlled, and he set her down gently on the narrow cot bolted to the wall, the metal frame creaking under the shift in weight. The interior lights flickered once before stabilizing, casting a soft, amber glow that reflected off her skin. And for the first time since he had lifted her from the platform, he really looked at her, not as something he had saved, but as something he did not yet understand. Up close, the details became clearer, the subtle patterns beneath her skin that shifted like faint constellations, the way her breathing had already steadied beyond what her condition should have allowed, the way her eyes, now fully open, held no trace of confusion or fear, only focus. "You are recovering fast," he said, reaching for the med kit mounted beside the cot, pulling out a scanner and running it slowly over her arm, watching the readings stabilize in ways that did not match any biological profile he recognized, the device hesitating for a fraction of a second as if recalibrating itself. She followed the movement of the scanner, then looked back at him, and there was something different in her expression now, not vulnerability, not strength exactly, but awareness, like a line had been crossed, and she was no longer pretending it had not. "I was never as weak as they believed," she said quietly, and the way she said it made Ethan's hand pause mid-motion, the scanner still hovering inches above her skin. "But I needed them to think I was," and before he could respond, before he could even decide what that meant, the comm unit on his console crackled again, louder this time, the static resolving into a low, steady signal that filled the small space with a sound that was not meant for him. And as Ethan turned toward it, a single line of light appeared across the viewport, far in the distance, too precise to be natural, too steady to ignore, and for the first time since he left the market, he realized that whatever had been watching was no longer waiting. The line of light did not move like a ship. It did not flicker or drift. It held perfectly still across the viewport as if it had always been there and the universe had only just decided to let Ethan see it. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the signal, not the timing, but the precision of it, the way it ignored distance like it did not matter. The comm unit beside him pulsed again, the static smoothing into a low harmonic tone that vibrated through the metal walls, subtle but constant, like a frequency searching for something to lock onto. And Ethan stepped closer to the console, fingers hovering over the controls before he forced himself to slow down, to think, because reacting too fast out here usually meant reacting wrong. "That is not local," he said under his breath, eyes narrowing as he adjusted the receiver, cycling through bands that should have returned nothing but background noise. Yet every channel carried the same tone, identical, unwavering, like it had already overwritten the system. Behind him, Lyra shifted on the cot, the faint sound of fabric brushing metal drawing his attention just enough for him to glance back. And what he saw made him pause in a way the signal had not, because she was sitting up now without effort, the earlier weakness gone not gradually but completely, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, and the glow beneath her skin no longer flickering but flowing, soft lines of light tracing patterns that felt deliberate, almost structured. "You said they were watching," he said, turning halfway between her and the console, trying to keep his voice level even as the air in the room seemed to change. "Is that them?" Lyra followed his gaze to the viewport, her expression calm, almost familiar, as if the sight outside was not a surprise but a confirmation. And when she spoke, her voice carried none of the strain it had before, only clarity. "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of the answer landed heavier than anything else she could have said. Ethan let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair as he looked back at the console, at the signal that refused to behave like anything he understood, and a thought pressed forward that he did not want to fully form, because it would change everything about the last hour, about the choice he had made back in the market, about the way she had looked at him. "You knew," he said, Not quite a question, more like a realization he was trying to test out loud. And for a moment there was silence, not empty this time but measured, like she was deciding how much to reveal. I suspected, Lyra replied, standing now with a fluid motion that carried none of the hesitation of someone recovering from injury, her bare feet touching the cold metal floor without flinching, the light beneath her skin reflecting faintly across the interior walls. But I needed to be certain. She continued, stepping closer, her presence filling the small space in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with focus. Ethan watched her carefully, every instinct telling him that the situation had shifted beyond anything he had prepared for, that the rules he relied on out here were no longer enough. And yet he did not step back, did not reach for a weapon or a control, because something in her gaze held him in place. Not force, not fear, but intent. Certain of what? He asked, and this time his voice was quieter, not weaker, just aware. Lyra stopped a few feet from him, close enough that he could see the subtle movement of those patterns beneath her skin, like constellations rearranging themselves in real time. And when she answered, there was no hesitation at all. Of you, she said, and the words settled between them with a weight that did not belong to a simple explanation. Before he could respond, before he could decide whether to push further or pull back, the tone from the comm unit shifted, rising slightly, aligning with something beyond the ship and the line of light. Outside expanded, not in size but in clarity, resolving into multiple points, dozens, perfectly spaced across the horizon like a formation that had always been there, waiting for the moment it would be seen. And as the ship's systems flickered in response, Ethan understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had been watching him was no longer observing from a distance. It had arrived. The ship did not feel like his anymore, not with the way the systems responded to something outside his control, lights dimming and stabilizing in patterns he had never programmed. The low hum of the engine shifting pitch as if it were listening instead of running, and Ethan stood there in the center of it, caught between instinct and understanding, because every part of him said to power up, to leave, to put distance between himself and whatever had just appeared beyond the ridge. But something deeper held him still, something quieter that had been building since the moment he saw her on that platform. You tested me, he said slowly, the words forming with a weight that felt heavier than the air around him, and Lyra did not deny it, did not soften it. She simply met his gaze with that same steady focus, as if the truth did not need to be explained, only acknowledged. Yes, she said, and the single word carried more meaning than any long explanation could have, because it confirmed everything he had been trying not to think about, that this was never random, never chance, that every step from the market to this ship had been part of something larger than survival. Outside, the points of light shifted again, not closer, not farther, just aligning, forming a pattern that felt deliberate, precise beyond anything human navigation could achieve, and the comm unit's tone deepened, resonating through the floor beneath his boots, through the metal walls, through his chest, until it felt less like a sound and more like a presence. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to relax at his sides, because tension would not change what was happening. And for the first time since this began, he looked at her not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who had chosen to be here, chosen to stand in his ship, chosen to watch him the way she had. What happens now? He asked, not demanding, not afraid, just ready, because whatever came next, it was already in motion. Lyra turned slightly toward the viewport, the soft light beneath her skin reflecting in the glass, blending with the distant formation until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. And when she spoke, her voice carried a calm certainty that made the chaos outside feel almost distant. Now, she said, they decide. And the words settled into the space between them like a quiet verdict. Ethan followed her gaze, watching as the formation shifted once more. The points of light dimming and brightening in sequence, not randomly, but in a pattern that repeated, like a signal, like a language, and for a moment he wondered if she could understand it, if she had always understood it, if this entire moment was something she had been waiting for long before he ever saw her. And if they do not like what they see? He asked, because that question mattered more than any other, not just for him, But for everything beyond this ridge, beyond this world, Lyra was silent for a second, just long enough for the weight of the question to settle fully. And then she looked back at him, really looked this time, not measuring, not testing, just seeing. And something in her expression shifted, subtle but real, like a decision had already been made even before the answer was spoken. Then none of this would matter, she said quietly, and there was no threat in her tone, no warning, just truth, simple and absolute. The ship's systems flickered again, the calm unit tone rising one final time before stabilizing into a steady signal that no longer searched, no longer reached, but held, and outside. The formation locked into place, the points of light no longer shifting but fixed in a configuration that felt final, like the end of a process rather than the beginning of one. Ethan stood there, feeling the silence that followed, not empty, not uncertain, but heavy with something unspoken. And for the first time, he realized that whatever decision had just been made, it was not about power, not about strength, not about what humanity could build or destroy. It was about something much smaller, something quieter, something that had happened on a rusted platform in the middle of a forgotten market. And as he looked at Lyra, at the faint light still moving beneath her skin, he understood that the choice he thought had cost him everything might have been the only thing that mattered at all. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the ship like a held breath that refused to release. And Ethan realized that whatever signal had passed between the lights outside had already concluded something final, something irreversible. Yet nothing had physically changed. The ground was still frozen beneath the hull, the air still thin and cold, his ship still barely holding together. And yet everything felt different, like the weight of the moment had shifted the meaning of the space itself. He stepped closer to the viewport, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the formation now locked across the horizon. Dozens of distant points arranged with unnatural precision, not drifting, not scanning, simply present. And the longer he looked, the more it felt like they were not observing the planet, but him, or more specifically, the decision he had already made. Behind him, Lyra moved again, her footsteps quiet against the metal floor, controlled and certain, and when she stopped beside him, the faint glow beneath her skin reflected faintly in the glass, merging with the distant lights in a way that made it difficult to separate her from them. "It is complete," she said softly, and the words carried a sense of closure that did not match the unanswered questions filling his mind. Ethan let out a slow breath, folding his arms loosely as he leaned slightly toward the viewport, grounding himself in something physical, something familiar, even as the situation stretched beyond anything he understood. "You keep saying that like I should know what it means," he replied, not accusing, just honest, because he had reached the point where guessing was no longer useful. Lyra turned her head slightly toward him, her expression calm but no longer distant. And for the first time since this began, there was something almost human in the way she considered him before answering. "My people do not make contact blindly," she explained, her voice even, measured. "We observe. We test. We choose carefully what we allow into our reach," she continued, and Ethan felt the implication settle in before she even finished the thought. "You mean alliance," he said quietly, the word feeling heavier than it should have, because it was not just a possibility anymore. It was something that had just been decided somewhere beyond his control. Lyra nodded once, a small, precise motion, or absence, she added. And the simplicity of that contrast made it clear there had never been a middle ground. Ethan looked back at the lights, at the perfect stillness of them, and for a moment he imagined what that decision might mean on a scale far beyond this ridge, beyond this world, beyond a single broken ship and a man who had traded everything he had for someone everyone else dismissed. And this, he gestured faintly around him, at the ship, at her, at the quiet aftermath of a choice he had made without thinking about anything beyond the moment. "This was part of that test?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said aloud. "Yes," Lyra replied without hesitation. "Not the only one, but the one that mattered most." And that answer settled deeper than he expected, because it reframed everything, every second from the market to now, not as coincidence, but as evaluation. Ethan shook his head slightly, a quiet, almost disbelieving motion. You based something that big on one decision, he said, and there was no anger in it, just quiet disbelief, because it felt impossible that something so small could carry that kind of weight. Lyra stepped a fraction closer, close enough that he could see the subtle shift in her expression again, not distant now, not observing, but present, and when she spoke, her voice softened just enough to change the meaning of the words. It was never just one decision, she said. It was the reason behind it. And that stopped him more than anything else had, because there was no system, no calculation, no measurable variable he could point to, just a moment, a choice made. Without expectation of reward. Outside, the formation of lights began to dim, not abruptly, but gradually, each point fading in sequence until the horizon returned to darkness, and the signal in the comm unit softened with it, the steady tone lowering until it blended back into the quiet hum of the ship's systems, as if whatever had been present had already begun to withdraw. Ethan watched it happen, the disappearance of something vast and controlled and entirely beyond him, and he felt an unexpected sense of finality settle in. Not relief, not fear, just understanding that whatever had just passed had already shaped something far beyond this moment. He turned slightly, looking at Lyra again, really looking this time, not at the glow beneath her skin or the precision in her movements, but at the way she stood there now, no longer testing, no longer observing, just present in a way she had not been before. So what does that make me? He asked quietly, not expecting a simple answer, because nothing about this had been simple. Lyra held his gaze for a second longer than usual, and when she answered, there was something new in her voice, something that had not been there before the lights arrived. It makes you the reason they chose to stay, she said, and the words did not echo, did not linger. They simply settled into the space between them, quiet and absolute, like a truth that did not need to be repeated. The words lingered longer than Ethan expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, and simplicity had a way of cutting deeper than anything complicated. And he stood there for a moment trying to fit them into something that made sense, something grounded, because the idea that a decision made in a dusty market could ripple outward into something that large did not sit easily in his mind. He let out a slow breath and looked away from Lyra, back toward the viewport where the last traces of light had already faded, leaving only the familiar emptiness of the horizon. But it did not feel the same anymore, not after knowing what had been there just seconds ago. They chose to stay, he repeated quietly, more to himself than to her, as if saying it out loud might make it feel less abstract, less impossible. Stay where, he added, because that part still mattered, still grounded everything in something real. Lyra followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful in a way that was new, less distant, more engaged, and when she answered, her voice carried that same steady calm, but now there was something warmer beneath it. Here, she said, in your reach, in your future. And the way she said it made it clear she was not talking about this one world, this one ridge, this one ship, but something far larger, something that extended beyond anything Ethan had ever planned for. He gave a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh, running a hand over the back of his neck as he turned away from the viewport, pacing a few steps across the narrow cabin just to feel movement again, something normal, something his body understood. You are telling me that everything out there, he gestured loosely toward the empty sky, made a decision about an entire species because of one guy with 200 credits and a bad habit of making the wrong choices, he said, and there was humor in it, but it was thin, edged with something deeper he had not quite named yet. Lyra watched him as he moved, not with the distant observation from before, but with a quiet attention that followed the rhythm of his steps, and when she spoke, her words landed softer this time, but with more weight. You did not make the wrong choice, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just certainty. Ethan stopped mid-step, glancing back at her, a faint frown forming as he leaned one hand against the console, grounding himself again in the familiar cool surface of metal and circuitry. I lost everything I had, he replied, not defensive, just factual, because that part was still true, still measurable, still real. Lyra stepped closer, not invading his space, but closing the distance enough that her presence felt intentional, and the soft glow beneath her skin reflected faintly across the console between them. "You exchanged it," she corrected gently, "for something your kind rarely values correctly." And that made him pause again, because there was no judgment in her tone, only observation, and that somehow made it harder to dismiss. He looked at her for a second longer, really looked, at the steadiness in her posture, the clarity in her eyes, the way she no longer seemed like someone recovering from anything, and he realized that whatever role she had been playing before, it was over now, completely gone. "And what exactly did I get in return?" he asked, not expecting a simple answer, but needing to hear how she would frame it, because so far, everything about this had shifted his understanding of value in ways he was still trying to catch up with. Lyra held his gaze, and for the first time since he met her, there was something unmistakably human in the way she hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration, like the answer mattered in a different way now. "A future that was not guaranteed," she said finally, her voice quieter, more personal, and the words settled into him in a way that felt different from everything else she had said, less like information, more like something given. The ship hummed softly around them, the systems stabilizing now that the signal had faded, returning to the familiar rhythm of barely functioning survival. And yet the space felt changed, not physically, but in the way silence now carried meaning instead of emptiness. Ethan exhaled slowly, pushing himself off the console as he glanced around the small interior, at the worn panels, the patched wiring, the narrow cot where she had lain not long ago pretending to be something she was not, and he shook his head slightly, a quiet, almost amused motion at the absurdity of it all. "You know," he said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth despite everything. "Next time someone offers me a deal like that, I might ask a few more questions," and Lyra's expression shifted just enough to mirror that tone, not quite a smile, but close, like she was learning the shape of it. "There will be no next time like this," she said, and there was something final in that statement, not ominous, not heavy, just true. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that without needing to argue, because deep down, he knew she was right. Moments like this did not repeat. They only changed what came after. And as he looked back toward the viewport one more time, at the empty horizon that no longer felt empty, he understood that whatever came next, whatever future had just been decided beyond his sight, it had already started here, in the smallest possible choice, made without certainty, without reward, and somehow, that had been enough. The quiet inside the ship did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, not by sound or movement, but by the weight of what had just happened, and Ethan found himself standing still longer than he usually allowed, as if moving too quickly might break something fragile that had settled into place. The systems hummed in their usual uneven rhythm, a soft vibration under his boots that reminded him this was still the same patched-together vessel he had been flying for years, still running on borrowed time and careful maintenance. And yet, even that familiar imperfection seemed different now, like it was part of a story that had just shifted direction. He moved toward the control panel, fingers brushing over the worn switches and cracked displays, more out of habit than necessity, checking readings that had not changed in any meaningful way. Fuel levels low, power reserves stable for now, environmental controls holding at a barely comfortable range, all the small details that used to define his limits, his decisions, his future. "So what do I do with that?" he asked quietly, not turning around, his eyes still on the panel even though he was not really seeing it, because the question had been building since her last words, since the moment she reframed everything he thought he understood about value and consequence. Behind him, Lyra did not answer immediately, and the pause felt intentional, not uncertain, like she was choosing her words with the same care she had shown since the beginning, but now for a different reason, not to test him, but to meet him where he stood. "You continue," she said finally, her voice calm, but no longer distant, carrying a tone that felt almost grounded, like she was speaking from within the moment rather than observing it from outside. Ethan let out a faint breath that could have been a laugh if it had more energy behind it, shaking his head slightly as he leaned both hands on the console, the cool metal steady under his palms. "Continue what?" he replied, glancing over his shoulder now, his expression more curious than anything else, because the idea of continuing as if nothing had changed felt impossible, and yet stopping did not make sense either. Lyra stepped closer again, her presence no longer unfamiliar, no longer something he needed to adjust to, and she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the console, not touching him, but close enough that the faint warmth from her skin carried across the small space. "The same thing you did before," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "You choose." And the simplicity of it landed differently this time, not as an abstract idea, but as something tangible, something he had already proven he understood without realizing it. Ethan studied her for a moment, the faint patterns beneath her skin still shifting in slow, deliberate motion, like something alive beyond simple biology, and he realized that whatever she was, whatever her people were, they valued something he had never seen quantified before, something that could not be measured in credits or fuel or survival odds. "You make it sound easy," he said, not dismissive, just honest, because nothing about his life had ever been easy, and choices like that usually came with consequences he had to carry alone. Lyra's expression softened slightly, not with pity, but with understanding, and that alone made the moment feel different from anything he had experienced before. "It is not easy," she replied. "That is why it matters." And there was something in the way she said it that settled deeper than logic, deeper than explanation, because it aligned with something he had always known but rarely trusted. Outside, the sky had fully darkened now, the last traces of reflected light gone, leaving only a vast expanse of stars scattered across the horizon. And for the first time since he had landed on this world, Ethan noticed how still they seemed, how constant, how indifferent to everything happening below. And yet now he knew that somewhere beyond that stillness, decisions were being made, paths were shifting, futures were opening or closing based on moments that seemed insignificant at the time. He pushed himself upright, rolling his shoulders slightly as if shaking off the weight of the last hour, and glanced toward the hatch, toward the world outside that had not changed and yet felt entirely different. "I guess I should get this thing moving again," he said, gesturing lightly toward the controls, because action was the only way he knew how to process something this large, to bring it back into something he could handle one step at a time. Lyra nodded once, a small, affirming motion, and stepped back just enough to give him space, but not distance, and that distinction did not go unnoticed. As Ethan reached for the ignition sequence, his fingers pausing for just a fraction of a second before engaging the system, he felt something settle into place inside him, not certainty, not understanding, but direction, and as the ship responded with a low, rising hum, lifting slightly against the frozen ground beneath it, he realized that whatever had just been decided out there in the dark, it had not taken control of his future, it had simply opened it. And for the first time in a long time, the unknown ahead did not feel like something to survive, it felt like something to step into. The engines responded with a low, uneven growl as the ship lifted a few inches off the frozen ground, stabilizers whining as they compensated for the uneven terrain, and Ethan kept his hands steady on the controls, eyes scanning the flickering readouts, not because he expected something to fail, but because that was what he had always done. That was how he stayed alive, by focusing on what he could control even when everything else shifted beyond him. The hull creaked softly as the ship adjusted its balance, the familiar sound grounding him in something real, something predictable, and for a moment, it almost felt like nothing had changed, like he was just another scavenger preparing to leave another dying world behind. But the silence outside told a different story, a deeper one, because it was not empty anymore. It was watched, not in a threatening way, not in a way that demanded action, but in a way that acknowledged, that observed with purpose rather than curiosity. He eased the throttle forward, just enough to test the response, and the ship hovered steadily, holding position against the thin wind that brushed across the hull. And as he did, he felt it again, that subtle shift in awareness, like stepping onto a stage he had never known existed. "Coordinates?" he asked without looking back, the question automatic, part of a routine that usually required no thought, just input and execution. Behind him, Lyra did not move to a console, did not reach for controls or data. She simply stood there, her presence quiet but undeniable, and when she answered, her voice carried a calm certainty that made the question feel different, less about direction and more about choice. Anywhere, she said, and the words settled into the space with a weight that surprised him. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing briefly over his shoulder, one eyebrow lifting slightly as if to confirm he had heard correctly, because in his world, coordinates mattered, destinations mattered. Every jump calculated down to the last unit of fuel. That is not how this usually works, he replied, not dismissing her answer, just acknowledging the difference between what he knew and what she implied. Lyra stepped closer again, her reflection faint in the forward display, blending with the dim stars beyond, and she placed her hand lightly against the edge of the console, the same place she had before, as if grounding herself in the same reality he relied on. It is now, she said, and there was no force behind it, no command, just a quiet confidence that made it difficult to argue with. Ethan studied her reflection for a moment, then turned his attention back to the controls, fingers hovering over the navigation panel as he considered something he had not allowed himself to consider in a long time, not since survival became the only goal that mattered. He pulled up the star map, the display flickering before stabilizing into a scatter of known routes and unexplored sectors, each one marked by risk, by uncertainty, by the unknown he had spent years avoiding. You realize I usually pick the safest route, he said, his tone lighter now, not joking, but not entirely serious either, because something about this moment allowed for that shift, allowed for something beyond pure calculation. Lyra did not respond immediately, but when she did, her answer came with a softness that felt deliberate, almost encouraging. That is why you were not chosen for your caution, she said, and there was no criticism in it, only truth, and that truth landed differently now, not as a flaw, but as something valued. Ethan exhaled quietly, a faint smile forming despite himself as he selected a point on the map that he had always ignored, a sector marked by incomplete data and inconsistent signals, the kind of place he would normally avoid without a second thought. Then I guess it is time to try something different, he said, more to himself than to her, as he locked in the coordinates, the system accepting the input with a soft confirmation tone. The engines shifted again, the hum deepening as the ship prepared for full ascent, and as the ground slowly dropped away beneath them, Ethan felt something settle into place, not certainty, not safety, but purpose, something he had not felt in a long time. Beside him, Lyra remained still, watching not the controls, not the displays, but the path ahead, her expression calm, but no longer distant, no longer evaluating, just present, as if this moment mattered in a way even she had not expected. The stars stretched slightly as the ship climbed higher, the atmosphere thinning until the blackness of space opened fully before them, vast and silent, and filled with possibilities Ethan had spent years ignoring. And as the ship aligned for its jump, he realized that for the first time, he was not leaving something behind. He was moving towards something unknown, something uncertain, something chosen. And as the engines surged and the stars began to bend into lines of light, he understood that whatever test had been placed before him, whatever decision had been made beyond his sight, it had not ended with that moment in the market. It had only just begun. The stars stretched into thin lines of white and blue as the ship slipped into transit, the vibration under Ethan's hands smoothing out into something almost silent, almost unreal, and for a moment he forgot to breathe, not out of fear, but because the transition always felt like stepping outside of time itself, like the universe paused just long enough to let you pass through it. The controls glowed softly in front of him, stable for once. No flickering warnings, no erratic readings, just a steady stream of data that told him everything was holding together better than it had any right to. And he could not help but notice that even his ship seemed calmer, as if whatever had passed between those distant lights had left an imprint here too. Beside him, Lyra remained still, her gaze fixed forward, not at the controls, not at the readouts, but at the shifting tunnel of light ahead, her expression unreadable in the dim glow of the cockpit. And yet there was something in the way she stood, something grounded, like she was no longer waiting for something to happen, but witnessing something already in motion. Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat, one hand resting loosely on the console, the other adjusting minor course stability out of habit, and he let the silence settle again. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just present, like both of them understood that the next part of this did not need to be rushed. "You said this was not the only test," he said after a while, his voice low but clear, cutting gently through the quiet, because that thought had not left him, not since she first mentioned it. And now that they were moving, now that the immediate moment had passed, it felt more important than ever. Lyra did not look at him right away, her focus still on the path ahead, and when she spoke, her tone carried that same calm certainty. But now there was a layer beneath it, something more reflective, more personal. "It was the only one that could not be measured," she said, and that answer made him pause, because it did not sound like something designed. It sounded like something discovered. Ethan turned his head slightly, studying her profile in the dim light, the faint patterns beneath her skin still shifting slowly, no longer reacting, just existing, like a steady current beneath the surface. "And the others?" he asked, not pushing, just following the thread she had opened, because he had learned by now that answers from her did not come all at once. They unfolded. This time, she did turn toward him, and for a second, there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, something that looked almost like hesitation, not uncertainty, but care, as if the answer mattered in a way it had not before. "They will come," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the air in the cockpit feel slightly heavier, like a promise that had already begun to take shape. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought, because he understood what she meant even if she had not explained it fully, understood that whatever had chosen to stay would not remain distant, would not remain abstract. It would become real, present, undeniable. "And when they do?" he asked quietly, his voice softer now, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because he could feel the scale of what was coming, even if he could not yet see it. Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer than usual, and when she answered, her voice carried something new, something that felt less like observation and more like connection. "Then your kind will be seen as you were today," she said, and the words settled into him with a clarity that cut through every doubt he had been holding on to, because they were not about power, not about technology, not about strength. They were about something far simpler, something far harder to define. Ethan exhaled slowly, looking back toward the shifting light ahead, the endless stretch of motion that carried them forward into something unknown, and for the first time, he felt the weight of what that meant, not just for him, but for everyone who shared his world, his species, his flawed, unpredictable way of making choices that did not always make sense. The ship continued its steady course, system stable, engines humming in quiet harmony, and as the light around them began to soften, signaling the end of transit approaching, Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be like anything he had faced before, because this time, it would not just be about survival, it would be about representation, about being seen, about showing something that could not be faked or forced. He tightened his grip slightly on the controls, not out of tension, but out of readiness. And as the tunnel of light began to collapse back into the vast darkness of space, he understood one thing with complete clarity. The test had not ended. It had only changed, and this time, the outcome would not depend on what he chose for himself, but on what his kind chose when they finally realized they were no longer alone. The light collapsed around them in a soft, silent motion, like the universe folding back into itself, and the stars returned all at once, sharp and distant and impossibly still. And for a brief second Ethan felt disoriented, not physically, but in that deeper way that came when something shifted inside faster than the mind could follow. The ship steadied with a low hum, systems recalibrating automatically, the navigation panel flickering once before locking onto the new coordinates, and everything looked normal again. The same endless field of stars, the same quiet darkness stretching in every direction. But it did not feel the same, not anymore. Ethan leaned forward slightly, scanning the forward display, eyes narrowing as he processed what he was seeing, because the sector he had chosen, the one he had always avoided, was not empty like it should have been, not chaotic either, but structured, subtle lines of faint light forming geometric patterns across the void, barely visible unless you knew where to look. like something had been placed there with intention rather than chance. That is not natural, he said quietly, more to himself than to Lyra, because after everything, stating the obvious felt like a way to stay grounded, to keep his thoughts from drifting too far ahead. Beside him, Lyra did not seem surprised, her gaze steady as she took in the same patterns, her expression calm but focused in a way that suggested recognition rather than discovery. "No," she replied softly, "it is not." And there was no need for further explanation, not yet, because the evidence was already in front of them. Ethan adjusted the ship's trajectory slightly, bringing them closer, not too fast, not too direct, just enough to observe without announcing themselves more than necessary. Though a part of him suspected that whatever had created those patterns already knew they were here, already accounted for their arrival. The closer they moved, the clearer the structure became, not solid objects, not ships in any conventional sense, but fields, layers of energy woven together in precise formations that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat slowed to a scale far beyond human perception. The air inside the cockpit felt different again, not heavier, not lighter, just charged, like the space itself was reacting to something unseen, something just out of reach of his understanding. "You knew this was here," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, not accusing, just acknowledging the pattern that had been building since the beginning. Because nothing about this felt accidental anymore. Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, and that hesitation mattered more than anything else, because it was the first time she had not responded with immediate certainty. "I knew something would be," she said finally, her tone measured, but there was something beneath it now, something closer to anticipation than control. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip on the controls tightening just slightly as he guided the ship along the edge of the formation, careful not to cross into it without understanding what that might trigger, because instinct still mattered, caution still had its place, even now. "And this is the next part of the test," he said, not a question, because it no longer felt like one, just a statement of fact. Lyra turned toward him then, fully this time, and for a moment, the faint glow beneath her skin intensified, the patterns shifting faster, more defined, like a response to proximity, to presence, to something aligning between her and what lay outside. "No," she said softly, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation, because it contradicted everything he expected. Ethan frowned slightly, glancing between her and the formation beyond the viewport, trying to reconcile the difference between what he thought was happening and what she was telling him. "Then what is it?" he asked, and there was no tension in his voice now, just a quiet readiness to understand whatever came next. Lyra stepped closer, her reflection overlapping with the faint patterns of light outside, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that felt different from before, less like observation, more like revelation. "This is not a test," she said. "This is where they begin." And as the words settled into the space between them, the formation outside responded, the faint lines of light brightening in unison, not aggressively, not abruptly, but with a deliberate precision that made it clear they had been waiting, not for any ship, not for any signal, but for this moment, for this arrival, for him. The light did not rush toward them. It unfolded, slowly, deliberately, like something vast deciding how much of itself to reveal at once. And Ethan found his hands still on the controls, but no longer moving, because instinct told him this was not something to outrun or outmaneuver. This was something to witness. The geometric patterns outside the viewport began to shift, lines of energy bending and reconnecting in ways that felt almost organic despite their precision, forming structures that were not quite solid, not quite light, something in between, something that existed beyond the simple definitions he had relied on his entire life. The ship responded in subtle ways, the instruments stabilizing further, the faint vibrations smoothing into near silence, like it was being held in place rather than maintaining position on its own. And that realization settled deep in his chest, not as fear, but as awareness, because whatever this was, it was in control without needing to show it. Beside him, Lyra stood completely still, her gaze fixed forward, the glow beneath her skin intensifying again, the shifting patterns now moving in perfect synchronization with the structures outside. as if she was not just observing them, but connected to them in a way that transcended distance. "They are aligning," she said quietly, and her voice carried a tone Ethan had not heard before, something closer to reverence than certainty, like even she was witnessing something greater than expectation. Ethan swallowed once, his throat dry despite the controlled air inside the cockpit, and he leaned slightly closer to the viewport, not out of curiosity alone, but because something in him needed to see this clearly, needed to understand even a fraction of what was unfolding. The structures began to form a central point, lines converging into a shape that pulsed with a steady rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat, but slower, deeper, more deliberate, and as it stabilized, a soft wave of light moved outward from that center, passing through the space around the ship without resistance, without impact, but with undeniable presence, like a silent acknowledgement. The comm unit flickered again, not with static this time, but with clarity, a signal forming that was not sound, not exactly, but something his system translated into a tone so pure it felt almost like it bypassed his ears and settled directly into his thoughts. Ethan did not speak, did not move, because the moment demanded stillness, demanded attention, and for the first time since this began, he felt truly small, not insignificant, but part of something so vast that his usual measures of scale no longer applied. Lyra stepped forward then, just one step, placing herself slightly ahead of him, not blocking his view, but positioning herself between him and the center of the formation. And when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that resonated with the signal itself, as if she was responding in a language that did not require translation. "He chose without command," she said, her words simple, but weighted, and though Ethan did not understand who she was addressing, he understood that it was not him. The light pulsed again, stronger this time, and the structures shifted once more, not closing, not retreating, but expanding, opening in a way that felt less like a barrier and more like an invitation. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers relaxing completely from the controls as he let the moment settle, because there was nothing he could do here, nothing he needed to do, and that was perhaps the strangest part of all, because his entire life had been built on action, on reaction, on constant movement. And now, for the first time, everything depended on something he had already done. "What are they waiting for?" he asked quietly, his voice almost lost in the stillness, not because he expected an immediate answer, but because the question felt necessary, like a bridge between what he understood and what he did not. Lyra did not turn back toward him, her gaze still fixed forward, her posture steady, grounded, and when she answered, her voice carried that same calm certainty, but now with something deeper beneath it, something that felt almost like trust. "For you to remain the same," she said, and the words settled into him with a quiet force, because they did not ask for more, did not demand change, did not require proof beyond what had already been given. The light at the center pulsed one final time, and the space before them opened fully, not with movement, but with clarity, revealing a path that had not been visible before, a corridor of aligned energy stretching forward into the unknown. And as Ethan looked at it, really looked, he understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that would not be defined by strength or technology, but by something far simpler, something he had not even realized he carried until the moment he chose to use it. The corridor of light did not pull them forward. It waited, steady and open, like a door that had no hinges and no need to close, and Ethan stood there with his hands resting lightly on the controls, not gripping, not forcing, just present, because for the first time since he had ever sat in that chair, movement did not feel like something he had to initiate. It felt like something he had to choose. The ship hovered at the threshold, engines quiet, systems stable in a way they had never been before, as if even the worn metal around him understood that this moment required stillness more than motion. Beside him, Lyra remained just ahead, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of the corridor, the patterns beneath her skin now calm, no longer shifting rapidly, but settled into a steady rhythm that mirrored the pulse of the structure outside. And for a moment, she looked less like a being out of place and more like something that belonged exactly where she stood. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the length of the path ahead, the way it extended beyond sight. not into darkness, but into something clearer, something that did not hide what it was, and that alone made it different from every unknown he had faced before. "You are not going with me," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization that formed without effort, because something in the way she stood told him this was where her role shifted, where the path divided. Lyra did not turn immediately, and when she did, her expression carried a calm that felt deeper than anything she had shown before, not distant, not observing, but resolved. "I was never meant to go where you go next," she replied softly, and there was no regret in her voice, no hesitation, just truth. Ethan nodded once, the motion small but steady, because he understood that too, even if part of him had not expected it. Even if part of him had already adjusted to her presence in ways he had not fully acknowledged. He glanced back at the controls, then forward again, weighing something that did not need to be weighed, because the choice had already been made long before this moment, back when he had not known what it meant. "Then I guess this is where I find out what that choice was really worth," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice now, no uncertainty, just a quiet acceptance of whatever came next. Lyra stepped closer then, not to stop him, not to guide him, but simply to stand beside him one last time, and she placed her hand lightly against his arm, the contact brief, gentle, but unmistakably real. "You already have," she said, and the words carried a warmth that had not been there before, something earned, something given, not as part of a test, but as something genuine. Ethan looked at her for a moment longer, committing the sight of her to memory in a way he did not usually allow himself to do, because attachments had always been a risk he could not afford. But this felt different, not like something to hold on to, but something to carry forward. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to her, and then his hands moved, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just guiding the ship forward into the corridor of light. The transition was not like the jump before, not a rush or a distortion, but a quiet shift, as if the space around him simply welcomed the motion, the ship gliding effortlessly along the path without resistance, without strain, and as the light enveloped the cockpit, Ethan felt something settle inside him, not a change, not a transformation, but a recognition of something that had always been there. Behind him, the space where Lyra had stood grew distant, not in distance, but in presence, like a chapter closing without needing to be sealed, and ahead, the path remained open, steady, waiting, not for a conqueror, not for a hero, but for someone who had chosen without expectation. And as the ship moved deeper into the light, leaving behind the broken world, the rusted market, the moment that had started it all, Ethan understood something with a clarity that did not need words, that he had not been chosen because he was strong, or skilled, or important. He had been chosen because he was human, and that, in a universe that measured everything else, had been enough.